All right, folks, it's 10 o'clock. So to respect everybody's time and to respect Gary Bentrup's time, we have to use Gary's last name because there are so many Garys on the call. We'll get started here. And I just want to introduce and thank Gary for agreeing to do this. He kind of agreed on short notice. So we're very appreciative that he could put something together for us. Gary's a research landscape planner for the USDA National Agroforestry Center, and has worked really, a lot of his research looks at how we can make our landscapes multifunctional for all sorts of different purposes. So not just a single function landscape. And so really he and I have had some great talks on urban forestry and the sort of interface between urban forestry and agroforestry in ways people don't typically think about. And so I'm excited to hear Gary talk today, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer questions as he goes through or near the end of the presentation. And Gary, if you want to go ahead and share your presentation. And while you're doing that, I'll just remind folks that after the forum presentation, there's a general membership meeting. So if you want to stick around on the call for that, we'll be chatting with the MnSTAC folks. And Gary, whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, Eric. And thanks for this opportunity to have a little presentation with you guys this morning. I appreciate it, although it was a little on a short notice, and I think Eric and I agreed to a reimbursement beer the next time I'm up in the Twin Cities area, so I'm gonna have to take him up on that. So anyhow, I'm gonna start off with a little bit of a presentation outline and going to talk about a brief overview of urban agriculture and kind of what are the benefits of trees and shrubs in helping achieve urban agriculture, and not just thinking about it in just the specifics of trees and shrubs, but really kind of a landscape ecology approach, but also talk about some of the potential problems and issues with incorporating trees and shrubs into the urban agricultural fabric, and then finish up with some resources that might be of interest. To begin though, I thought it might be worthwhile to give a little bit of just a personal landscape narrative, because I think that shapes the careers we pursue and our outlooks. And so I grew up on a farm in Southwest Kansas, and my playground was the family shelter belt shown in the lower left. And little did I know that I was going to be destined to end up in agroforestry. I pursued degrees in landscape architecture, as Eric mentioned, and now work at the USDA National Agroforestry Center here in Lincoln. We're a national center working on agroforestry issues across the US as well as the territories in the Pacific Islands. And probably many of you are familiar at least with the term of agroforestry, but it's the integration of trees and shrubs into crop livestock farming systems to create this suite of environmental, economic, and kind of social benefits. So today we're going to be kind of focused more on an urban environment, and agroforestry does fit within an urban environment. We often think of it maybe in a more rural context, but a couple kind of stats or figures to set the stage for this is that, you know, bulk of the population in the United States lives in metro areas. But our agricultural production often occurs elsewhere. And so, for instance, US produce has to travel significant distances to get to the urban population. And through that process, as well as others, we often have a lot of food waste. And we know that is an area we need to kind of close the gap on for many reasons. Then there's also the issue of food security. And roughly around 10% of households in the United States are food insecure at some point in time. This last year, it has gone down. Well, excuse me, there has been a trend downward, which is good. But I think COVID has revealed a little bit more food insecurity recently. And so, and it's not just an issue related to urban or rural environments. Food insecurity crosses all kind of sectors. But another piece of food insecurity I think is important to talk about is nutritional security. And this is really the idea of the kind of food we really need to have healthy lifestyles. And we can see from this chart, we are a little low on our fruits and vegetables in terms of what is recommended. And that's no surprise, we kind of know that. Where we get maybe more than we need of calorie intake from fats and sugars. So that's kind of a piece in this when we're thinking about agriculture. And so our food production portfolio across the United States really is pretty diverse. And that's one of the kind of factors of resiliency that we do have. But urban agriculture can be a piece in this portfolio. And we'll talk about whether it's really a significant piece or is it just kind of hobby farms. And urban agriculture really is not just about homegrown tomatoes from people's backyards. It really can be everything from apiary bee culture on rooftops to poultry farms to aquaculture to even including high-tech indoor hydroponic systems. That end of the scale is not really what my talk is going to focus on today, kind of more talking about outdoor systems where community forestry can play a role in supporting urban agriculture. And so kind of just a variety of urban agriculture systems that are currently out there. Of course, what we kind of initially think of just that home gardening kind of environment. Community gardens, but then there's also institutional gardens affiliated with schools or other organizations. And then there's kind of a whole range of commercial-based operations, whether they're focusing on more horticulture, plant-based products, or more protein-based systems. And this project or this example on the right is one that is actually a agroforestry, an urban agroforestry example. And it's called the Main Street Project, which several of you may be familiar with. It's in Minnesota, and it's kind of currently out of Northfield, but they're looking at poultry silvopasture systems and have both egg-laying and meat-producing systems, and they're scaling these up into kind of modular units to be able to provide healthy-based chicken production, but using a silvopasture system with elderberry, hazelnuts, and other plants. And so it kind of raises a question, is urban agriculture even really kind of significant? Is it something worth considering? And it's kind of hard to find great statistics on this, but here are a few. Globally, about 15 to 20% of our food is grown in cities. There's some estimates that it might actually be higher. From the National Gardening Association, a survey done in 2014 shows that food gardening in urban households is increasing. And I think this last year with COVID, there was a significant jump in that. But these following three stats, I think, are some of the most interesting to me. And 33% of farms are located within metropolitan districts. That encompasses about 16% of US total cropland. And based on this study, about 33% of the value of US ag production comes from these farms that are in this proximity. And so I think it is something that is significant and can play a role in that urban agriculture portfolio, or in that agriculture portfolio. And so what does urban ag kind of have to offer beyond just kind of the food aspect? Well, there's opportunities for job creation, a little reduction in waste, and also the opportunity to convert waste to resource. There's great examples of projects like Growing Power in the Detroit area, which goes around and gets compostable food items and compost it for organic inputs and fertilizer inputs for their urban agriculture systems. provides a way to reuse vacant lands. We've got the physical activity, community connections, and also biological habitat enhancement opportunities. And there's a bit of literature out on all these benefits, and as well as reports that try to quantify some of these benefits. And I'm not going to go any more in depth on that. Can find more on that. What I really want to focus today's presentation on is what is the role of urban and community forestry in supporting kind of urban agriculture. And this has already been recognized. It was in the 10-year Urban Agroforestry Action Plan that I'm sure many of you are pretty familiar with. I'm just going to pull out a few of the goals in it that really drilled into urban agriculture. And goal 2 was to promote the role of urban and community forestry in human wellness and health. And it specifically called out the action of urban forestry working with urban agriculture to support healthy eating. Some of the particular action items that the report called attention to was supporting the development of food forests and edible landscaping, connecting with urban agriculture and local food initiatives to enhance the access to fresh fruits, nuts, and vegetables. And then the opportunity to really build community forest health and biodiversity for resilience. And some actions there included identifying fruit trees, shrubs, and plants for urban areas, and looking at that maintenance, education, outreach, and planning when we're talking about kind of building these systems and going forward. So I want to now shift to talking about what are kind of some of the benefits of trees and shrubs in an urban agricultural context. And again, while it's kind of drilling down into thinking about the plants themselves, but also about that landscape ecology idea on how these things collectively can influence functions like microclimate, urban heat island, that we are also looking for in that urban environment. And this list by no means is complete. It's just a couple that I'm calling out to talk about a little more today. So fruit and nut products, as we kind of showed earlier with the slide and this graph here, we're really kind of low on having adequate fruit and nuts in our diet. And there really is opportunities. And here are species that can be grown in urban environments. There's quite a range, and some have cultivars that actually do well in urban environments. This is a columnar apple that was specifically kind of bred to be able to be used in more tighter urban environments. And I know, when we're talking Minnesota, we're like, well, we're kind of a colder climate, but, there really is opportunities to produce some of these products in our northern regions. And you may be familiar with this particular extension guide out of North Dakota. It's really nicely well done, in my opinion, on community orchards, but it's got a lot of great information on individual species that can be grown, including haskaps or honeyberries, which are particularly well suited for cold climates. Next is kind of the role that trees and shrubs or agroforestry can play in actually the food production system itself. In one area I have a lot of interest in, and it's been an area I've focused some of my work on, is around pollination and pollinator conservation. And we recently, with colleagues from the Xerces Society, published a science review of how agroforestry systems are influenced by, or how agroforestry systems can affect pollination and pollination conservation. And there's a couple key ways that it does this. And really in broadly, it's the ability to provide foraging resources and nesting sites. It be able to mitigate pesticide exposure if you're spraying an area and you're trying to need buffers to prevent that spray drift from going into other areas. And then there's also the kind of landscape ecology. Like any organisms, there needs to have landscape connectivity for these species to be able to reproduce and thrive and be able to move across the landscape. So drilling in a little bit more, I think trees and shrubs play a really key role in pollinators, pollination and pollination services. And they get overlooked because people tend to focus on herbaceous flowers because they're down low. We can see all the bees and the butterflies on it. And tree flowers often are a little bit more indiscreet. They're up high and they tend to get overlooked. However, they're some of our early flowering species, as you can see in this chart. They really start flowering in March and April and May. And this is when there's not a lot of herbaceous flowering plants out there. And so they really are important to kicking off early pollinator populations. Now, as we go into later season, of course, they're not really flowering that much. And so this is really where the herbaceous component comes into play. And so it's not, when we really think about ecology, it's really this suite of plant systems that we need to support all the different services that we want. To drive that point home a little bit more, here's a study out of Michigan, and it basically showed that for solitary bees and wild social bees, which are basically bumblebees, that in like April and May, you're talking that these species are collecting anywhere from 80 to 90% of their pollen totally from woody species. So it is truly important. And then to kind of wrap this point up, I like this example in that we're really thinking about a three-dimensional space. When we have a horizontal plane with herbaceous flowers, that can provide so many nectar sources, pollen sources in a square meter. But if we're thinking vertically with woody plants, we can really expand that opportunity by providing more in a smaller space. And this is really important in an urban environment where we have probably limited space to begin with. Moving on to kind of microclimate, a lot of the research about windbreaks providing crop benefits has occurred in more what we would say traditional crop field situations. But our urban environments also are subjected to a lot of wind. And so the opportunity to really support and enhance yields as well as quality of vegetable and fruit yields can be quite significant. The little chart on the right shows some of the studies that have looked at average increased. And the more you go up to things that are what I would say more vulnerable to wind abrasion or desiccation, like raspberries and strawberries, these things can really benefit from wind protection that can be provided by multifunctional windbreaks. We're probably all familiar with the benefits of urban forestry in terms of air quality. And so the opportunity to enhance that ability with supporting urban agriculture and increasing our urban canopy to help provide these air quality benefits really is there, especially when we're thinking about on that larger community scale. Now, this does feed into some of my next points regarding phytoremediation and food safety issues. Whether there's benefit here that could pose as a potential problem. And we'll dive into that. So according to one study, there's over 400,000 brownfield sites in the United States that by their assessment could actually be suitable for urban agriculture with appropriate redevelopment. And these aren't like the Superfund sites that are basically really toxic and you're probably going to have to landfill material, things of that nature. These are places where there may be some in situ contamination that can be maybe remediated with plants. And there's this nice report by EPA. It's a little old now, but it provides some good guidance on that. And so we know woody plants can provide a bit of benefit in a phytoremediation environment. You know, we have phytoremediation is basically a variety of processes, whether it's occurring at the root level and breakdown of contaminants, whether it's the translocation of contaminants into wood that is no longer accessible, and so forth. And one of the benefits with woody plants is you often translocate these more toxic metals and organics into locations where they don't come into human contact or food consumption. Some of the issues with growing more vegetable crops in these environments is that they can easily, like lettuce can translocate, you know, lead and other pollutants into the materials. And so there's been some studies done, and here's kind of just some of the highlights from looking at, you know, you could remediate sites with, you know, species that don't have food consumption issues, like willows and poplars. They're particularly pretty good for cadmium and zinc and organic pollutants. Studies that have looked at actually fruit and nut from trees and shrubs in urban environments, they tend to show very low attributes in trace metals. The trace metal content does depend on fruit type, it appears. So thinking about nuts, they're more lower than say palm and stone fruits, and then berries are some of the maybe more susceptible. And so, you know, a more toxic site, possibly it might be better to stray toward the other end of this scale. But in general, the edible tree portion is much lower than non-edible, non-woody edible species. And this picture on the right is one that maybe some of you might be familiar with. It's a boulevard in Issaquah, Washington, that's about a mile long. It has over 25 different nut and fruit species that people are allowed to go forage on. And they have a little printed guide to kind of let people know what the species are and when they are ripe and available for use. Moving on to extreme weather adaptation, and probably this is a good week for it, or a good couple weeks. We've seen some extreme weather, and we know we're probably going to have more and more of it, particularly with intense rainfall events. They are already have, over the past 2 decades or couple decades, have increased significantly, whether you're looking at a short-term intense event or longer-term intense precipitation event. And the projections are that's going to continue to increase. That's a particularly challenge in an urban environment where we have already impervious cover to begin with. So anything we can do to try to kind of reduce the impacts of these wet weather flows is a good thing. And so, you know, again, we kind of know from an urban community and forestry, the more we have a urban canopy, we're building more resiliency to weather issues like precipitation events. And you know, basically deep-rooted trees and shrubs are going to offer more resiliency in general to droughts and floods. We also know that canopy interception can be upwards around 20%. That can be a great benefit. And then we also have the ability to have vapor transportation and infiltration benefits. Of course, there's always some trade-offs that can be in this arena. And then urban heat island mitigation. Again, urban community forestry plays a key role in helping us mitigate that urban heat island. Here's just some stats from, you know, NOAC, we're all familiar with, and EPA. But if we're thinking about this larger community situation where we're also trying to enhance urban ag, we can also achieve this additional benefit when we're thinking about urban heat island mitigation. But we'd be remiss if we kind of didn't have at least a little bit of discussion on what are some potential problems and issues around kind of incorporating more trees and shrubs and urban forestry in the context of, say, urban agriculture. And one that I think comes to mind, there's been just some recent studies of the increase of pollen and its relationship to allergies and asthma issues. Some species might have more potential issues around contributing to these problems. So we might be able to provide some guidance on what recommendations, what species might be a little more less problematic for people with these health issues. There also is the issue of the tragedy of the commons, depending on how these things are used. If they're in a more open domain, public domain, where people can come and go and use it, there's always the problem of that aspect. But that could maybe be managed. Food safety issues, while we discuss that, you know, in general, trees and shrubs and the nuts and fruits that come from these can generally be safer. I think we still have some unknown food safety issues we need more research on. And so, for instance, particulate matter, collecting on the outside of a fruit product in an urban environment, you know, obviously you probably don't want to put it next right to a road, like maybe the Issaquah example, but how much of that can be actually washed off? Does it still present any type of safety issue? And so to me, that's one of the probably ones I think we still really need some good research on. Of course, as we're promoting these in an urban context, there's all these issues around maintenance and management. How do we grow these? You know, is there the type of pruning that would be needed? Do you start getting fruit drop that creates pest issues, things of that nature, that whole arena? And then last but not least is the climate change effects. You know, woody plants by and large can add resiliency to a landscape to reduce the effects of climate change. But like any biological system, it too will be impacted by climate change. And here's just a little chart talking about, you know, what are some of the changes in climate, and then obviously the consequences for tree growth and health. Even though they can be more resilient to droughts and floods, at some point that can affect growth rate and increase mortality, or have the indirect issue of being more susceptible to damaging effects of pests. Again, we're also looking at knowing that the species we recommend, thinking about them, often we're thinking long-lived species. And so thinking, what is our climate, you know, 10, or thinking of what is our climate 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the road, that these species need to be able to be adaptable enough to withstand those changes. And some are going to be more adaptable than not. Kind of getting close to wrapping up. Just going to talk just a few slides on food forests. I'm sure familiar with that term. I kind of thought food forests really hit the, you knew it was becoming a more of a popular lexicon term when this little kids newspaper that tries to provide education actually had an issue on food forests, and this was in the Rochester, Minnesota Post Bulletin back in 2014. But food forests have been around for some time. In the US, it's thought that the Dr. George Carver Edible Park in Asheville, North Carolina might be one of the earliest examples. It was established in 1997, and it has a whole variety of species that were planted in this. And this is an example of a public domain one that people can go access. But I will say food forests have been around for some time. There's a an example in Morocco that's over 2,000 years old. It's been continuously managed as a food forest for that time period. So while we think of it as a new idea, it's probably really one of our oldest forms of agriculture that we have really done around. And then kind of an example, I'm not super familiar with this one, and maybe Gary Wyatt might even know more on it, but is the Prairie Alley Food Forest in Laverne, Minnesota. I think it's just been established since maybe 2018. It was done with the University of Minnesota Extension, and provides what I think is really nice, kind of this educational opportunity to making people more aware of some of these different edibles that can be, either grown in a home landscape or grown more in a community garden environment. Last but not least, we have at the National Agroforestry Center, this last year, we received some funding to put out a urban agroforestry grant program. And this was to develop resources for promoting awareness around urban agroforestry. And it was really thinking about what are some of the different science delivery products that could be used. And so I'm going to just highlight 3 recipients that got awards from across the United States. And this one is out of Atlanta, Georgia, and they're producing some case studies, some testimonial videos from producers, also on how to actually do edible windbreak buffers, mushroom production. They're also looking at doing train the trainer workshops. This example is out of Hawaii. It's a very interesting one. This organization has a 100-acre basically food forest that they've already been managing with traditional ecological knowledge techniques for some time. And they're producing these educational videos on how to kind of do this across the Pacific Islands, and they're translating it into several Pacific Island languages. And then a final one is in the Washington, D.C. area where, again, similar to the Atlanta one, they're producing case studies, how-to resources, scenarios complete with actually some economic data on the costs and benefits. And all 3 of these projects are still in the production phase. We don't have any products yet available on our website from these, but we're hoping within the next year we'll have deliverables from these projects. And to put a plug in, we're going to have the opportunity to do this grant program again this year. So if you want to come to our website, the grants are in the neighborhood of 25 to 50,000. We'll be able to do several of them, and they'll be kind of doing that. And so I just saw a chat pop up. I wasn't sure if anybody was telling me like, wrap it up. Whoops, did I lose my, let's see. All right, and I'm getting close. So last but not least, some resources that might be of interest. There was this issue of Urban Forestry and Urban Greening back in October 2019 that's got some nice, really, articles on urban food forestry. I can get people copies of that if they would like. And then there was this handbook published by some friends and colleagues from Virginia Tech that provides kind of a how-to. It's a little more geared on the social side of food forest than maybe the nuts and bolts of kind of more the physical planning of food forests. And then putting a plug in for a few resources from the National Agroforestry Center. We've got this conservation buffer guide. It synthesizes research from over 1,400 research publications into illustrated design guidelines for designing basically woody buffers for recreation, wildlife, soil quality, water quality, etc. And here's just a snapshot of some of the other resources we have at our website. There's my email. We can drop into the chat, as well as our website. You can just also, thanks for putting that up, Eric. And with that, I'd like to entertain any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. That was great. I'm gonna, if it's okay with you, I'll put your email address in the chat as well if people have questions.
Yes.
And are there any questions for Gary to get us started? Well, I'll start us off unless somebody else wants to chime in. I'm curious, Gary, with the food forests in particular and the production of food from trees, I know some of that work is still ongoing, but is there data being recorded as to how much food is produced or how much time it takes to sort of maintain these forests or maintain the trees so that they are producing food?
That's a good question. And I think it's probably a little hit and miss depending on what the organization or whoever is kind of doing that. But that was one of the things with this urban forestry grant program, that we were really kind of trying to encourage people applying for it to have some good quantification of these different, cost, what are you getting out of it, things of that nature. So you could kind of provide people a realistic scenario. And so I think that's really important. It'd be nice to have more of a clearinghouse on it. That'll probably be down the road. My hope is I think the USDA is more and more getting invested in urban agriculture and realizing its somewhat significance. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more like the National Agricultural Statistics Survey doing a little more surveys, trying to kind of get at some of this quantification issues you bring up, at least what is being produced, because that's something they already do in their surveys, is like how much was produced by a particular farmer.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that'll be interesting. We have a couple of questions coming in, I think from Kevin McDonald. Are most of these community-based agroforestry initiatives led by volunteers? And what is the role of paid staff or AmeriCorps members?
That's a great question. I think, so again, it kind of varies. So the community-based ones, I would say, that are not like commercial ones, are fairly volunteer led. That said, some of the larger ones do have staff that are paid, like they're nonprofit organizations with paid staff. And so like the Washington, DC example, it's actually kind of through their parks program. And so they're city staff that are charged with promoting things in this arena. And I think the follow-up on that, what's the role of paid staff or AmeriCorps members? There are a bit of them that I think are incorporated AmeriCorps. So I think, depending on, it's kind of a mix system. There's one here in Lincoln that I'm just kind of peripherally involved. It's an all volunteer one. But there are some that have, I think the particular ones are the urban ag ones some of them are having paid staff, and they're now expanding into including some of this urban agroforestry.
Yeah, very good. Karen Zumak asks, are there liabilities associated with fruit production for public consumption on public property?
That is a great question. And I wish I had a good answer. I don't know, but I think it's an important one to explore. For instance, like that Gilman Boulevard in Issaquah, they're basically encouraging people to go along this boulevard and forage from the fruit. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to see, have they had any issues? How did they handle any potential liability? It would be great to get some as much as I hate to sometimes always bring lawyers in, it'd probably be worthwhile to bring some lawyers into this discussion and find out what are the risks and how do you manage those liability risks.
Yeah. We have a question from Jill. Can Gary say a little bit more about the tragedy of the commons?
Yeah, so it's kind of the idea that if, again, it's in a park, let's say, and you have all these plants producing products that people can just come in on their own and harvest, do you run in where basically a single person could come in and just harvest everything and not really kind of harvest what they need and, you know, harvest what they want and then try to even go sell it somewhere else, you know, where it really was meant to be more of a public good. So it's kind of getting at the issue of adequate sharing where there's not, where it's really just open for public foraging. So that's where I was trying to get at with the tragedy of commons kind of reference. Does that maybe help answer that question?
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that, have you seen in any of the public places that you've worked with or know about where they address that, or is it even an issue? Is it been pretty respectful as folks have been using or utilizing these spaces?
You know, I think it was raised more as a potential issue. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's not out there. I have not seen, at least in the forums or discussion groups or things like that, people actually documenting that being a problem. It's just the realization that, especially when you have resources that you're encouraging people to come collect off of publicly held ground, you could have actors who are not acting in the best interest of everybody.
Yeah.
And then another piece gets at kind of that volunteerism, you know, so you got volunteers kind of maintaining the system and the equity of like, are they able to take advantage of it? But where you might have people who aren't doing any effort and just kind of possibly freeloading, and that might be all right. These systems are sometimes put into places to address food insecurity in neighborhoods where they might not have ability to do this on their own. And so the goal isn't like, it's great, come and get it. That was why we put it in here. Those are all kind of context specific issues.
Yeah. So another one from, let's see, Kevin McDonald. You can answer this however you'd like. What will the Biden administration do to scale this up nationwide? Do you have any predictions on that? Your grant program is awesome, but unfortunately only helps a small number of communities. Is there any talk of Biden's ambitious new civilian climate corps to include agroforestry?
Yeah. So a couple, I think, questions in there. So we'll tackle the first one. To scale this up. Well, from what I've seen, I believe, so there was a bit of new funding that came in to urban agriculture. Actually, sorry, I got my office manager, one of my cats, walking across the screen. You know, there was a bit of actual funding put toward urban agriculture in this last couple fiscal years. That's how we actually ended up getting a piece of that funding to be able to offer this grant program. My guess is that it's fairly popular. I think we're going to still see funding put toward it. How much relative to other USD programs, I don't know, but at least I see administration that's pretty favorable to these ideas. So hopefully, the comment on the grant program only helps out a small number of communities. That is true, but our hope is actually the resources, the deliverables we're asking them to provide would help other communities. So the real goal is not, so this project, to be clear, is not so much in fact, we word it, it's not to be really used to put in projects. It's to deliver these science deliverable outreach tools and products, like the test, like the videos and so forth. I believe in that urban agricultural funding, the funding I was saying that's increased, there are funds available for pilot projects, demonstrations. So basically putting plants, things in the ground. Our particular grant, though, was really more about developing outreach materials with the hope of trying to, in a sense, train the trainer, expand that opportunity out there. Yeah, the Civilian Climate Corps. So we've been pitching it to include agroforestry, and we're hoping that won't fall on deaf ears. We don't know yet on the status of that. But it would really be a great opportunity to have that as part of that portfolio for the Civilian Climate Corps. So great point.
See if there's a, I had another one that actually came in via an email, and the question was regarding looking at, so you talked about pollinators and how valuable woody species can be, especially early in the season. And I really liked that you talk about this sort of you had the picture of the cube on top of the tree. And so we've got this vertical space that offers maybe much more pollinator habitat that we can do just on a horizontal plane. The questions that we get occasionally are, especially in the urban environment where we have a lot of non-native species we might be utilizing. Do you know of any, or is there talk in the kind of urban agricultural world about this? Is there benefit, or are there really more, are there negatives to using the non-natives and kind of how that plays out?
With regards to kind of pollinators?
Yeah, I think so. Really pollinators, birds, habitat, all of
Yeah.
that, those types of issues.
Yeah, and it's like most things, devil in the details a little bit. So there is research that says, no surprise, by and large, if you want to benefit your native pollinators, your native wildlife species, you use native plants. I mean, that's kind of a fairly tried and true thing that does hold up generally well. That said, there's also evidence of wildlife species using and adapting to non-native species, and can do well with them, depending on if it meets their ecological needs. Example is the endangered Southwest willow flycatcher. It now nests in salt cedar tamarisk, which is a scourge in the Southwest, but I'm not saying encouraging it. It's just, it has adapted to that non-native species. Getting back to kind of pollinators, it can really depend on flower structure. So when we've bred things to be like double cup and kind of funky floral things for, I'm kind of thinking more like herbaceous plants, but this is also true for, say, some of the shrubs. We've created flower structures that aren't as friendly to pollinators. So some of the horticulture varieties maybe are not, and there's some research coming out now on what species in urban environments are kind of beneficial, what are not. And then, just still speaking on the pollinator issue, honeybee is a non-native species. We rely on it great for crop pollination and honey, and it's great. It's fairly versatile in some of the species that we'll use, flowering species. And so I guess it kind of depends what our goal is. If it's kind of more pollinator conservation, we probably would lean toward the species that would really be beneficial. And I would point toward the Xerces Society. They've got some great resources regionally based on like what are recommended herbaceous and woody species and thinking about it in that temporal aspect. Like, here's a suite that I think they're like or not a trifold, basically a 4-pager spreadsheet that talks about these different species and kind of the temporal aspects, what species like them from a pollinator perspective, as well as what their flowering time. So you can build that full temporal supply of resources for pollinators. I think I probably wandered around on that one a little bit, but hopefully that maybe answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think there's increasing awareness and interest in how we, as you've worked on, make multifunctional landscapes in our urban environments as much as we can. So they're doing lots of things. Yeah. There's been, for those that are listening and are signed in via Zoom, you can see there's lots of Gary, Wyatt and I have, and some others have been posting some good links to some of the things that Gary Bentrup has been talking about. So if you want those, make sure that you're kind of capturing, going through those to get out those links and download some of the great publications and some of the grant opportunities. We have a few,
or go ahead.
Oh, we have a few minutes left, so if there are other questions that anybody has, be happy to.
See two maybe. I see Gary Wyatt asked about, we consider there's 5 agroforestry practices: alley cropping, silvopasture, windbreaks, forest farming, riparian forest buffers. It's like, should have them roll off. So, is there a movement to add a 6th practice, urban food forest? It's interesting. I think it's maybe our our tendency in the European-centric world of the U.S. Dominant, unfortunately, that we tend to want to categorize everything and put it in. And so we've got, I think it's more useful. We talk about this a lot at the Agroforestry Center, but really thinking about agroforestry as a continuum. And when you look at tropical agroforestry, where agroforestry really has kind of probably originated from, they don't get quite so hung up on categories. It's kind of this fluid gradient, and you find all flavors of systems. And so we kind of are more like, rather than kind of adding per se a specific 6 category, on our website, we kind of just call additional applications. And it's kind of the garbage can that says, here's all the other things that can be kind of done based off of more functional basis rather than worrying specifically about a term.
Yeah, good. I think Cameron Kaitonen had I think following up maybe on your comment on horticultural plants that are designed with really cool looking flowers, but maybe less functional from a pollinator standpoint, following up and thinking about finding ornamentals and being more trying harder to find things that don't have the pesticides kind of embedded in them, and that's helpful for pollinators as well.
Yeah, what's encouraging is it's starting to see more and more nurseries and big block stores trying to source material that is free of neonicotinoid, because they know that's kind of more what consumers are wanting, and so they're trying to meet that demand. So my hope is more and more of that will become available over time.